I want to talk to you tonight about Chickamauga. Anybody ever been to Chickamauga? Some of you have been to. It's one of the most pristine battlefields left in the United States. So if you never get a chance to go down there, please feel free to do so. Chickamauga is one of the things that fascinates me about this battle is the fact that you can tell the entire story of the fighting at Chickamauga through the movements of troops from one state. Can't do that at Gettysburg, can't do that at Shiloh, can't do that at Chancellorsville. You can at Chickamauga. I can tell you almost the entire story of the battle by just looking at the troops from one state. That state happens to be Texas. Now, I got involved in this project a few years ago when my friend Ted Savas from Savas Beatty called me and said, I got this manuscript idea. There's a park ranger in Texas that has sent this massive amount of raw data on Texans at Chickamauga. Can you turn that into a book? I'm like, sure, why not? What's it got to do with Gettysburg? And Ted's like, Chickamauga. I'm like, oh yeah, you said that. Never did anything on Chickamauga. I've been there about 20 times, but I can at least give it a shot. And the net result, of course, was a book. Let's step back. Chickamauga, river of death, supposedly. Although people dispute that. Chickamauga has at its very core the movements and fighting in central Tennessee in the spring of 1863. It all stems from a battle on December 31st, 1862, July 1st, 1863, that the Southerners called Murfreesboro and the Yankees called it Stones River. This fight is a bloody two-day affair, hinging around New Year's Day. Really doesn't do a lot other than kill a lot of soldiers and make a lot of people miserable. What it does do is create a stalemate in Tennessee between the two Army commanders. On the left is Braxton Bragg, commander of the Confederate Army of Tennessee, and on the right is his counterpart, commander of the Union Army of the Cumberland, William Starks Rosecrans. These two officers, perhaps shell-shocked by the carnage at Stones River, kind of sit and look at each other for weeks. Nothing goes on in Tennessee. Finally, the Confederates pull back into the central highlands of Tennessee and dig in for the winter. Well, that's fine. Most Civil War armies do that. But when the spring comes, the expectation is the armies will go back at each other, right? No. Spring happens and the two armies continue to look at each other. And in an amazing amount of coincidence, you should read the letters. They're almost identical. Jeff Davis sends messages to Bragg saying, I need you to protect Chattanooga. I need you to beat the Yankees. Do something. And at the same time, Abraham Lincoln is growing increasingly frustrated with General Rosecrans and telling him the same thing. I need you to get a move on. Nothing is going on in Tennessee. It's so bad that the President of the United States decides he's going to do a very unusual thing. Lincoln orders Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton to actually send the Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana, to Tennessee, because we need to have a little prod underneath General Rosecrans and get him moving. So this is the situation throughout much of the spring. Hardee, Polk, Bragg, these are names you've all heard, of course. They're all poked in here on the Oak Barrens and the Highland Rim of central Tennessee. The Yankees finally aren't doing anything. It's finally June of 1863. Anybody know what's dominating the newspapers in June of 1863? Robert E. Lee, as well as Vicksburg. You got Grant going to Vicksburg, you got Lee heading towards Pennsylvania, and what finally gets cranking in Tennessee, it's third-tier news. It's the Tullahoma campaign. Finally, Rosecrans gets his army moving, and they start pushing Bragg back down southward through a series of flanking maneuvers, and both presidents are concerned. Lincoln wants a decisive victory in Tennessee to open the door to Atlanta. Davis, on the other hand, needs the Yankees to be stopped before they can get to Chattanooga. And so this fighting in June leads to a continued Confederate withdrawal through central Tennessee towards Chattanooga. Now, Chattanooga is critical for a number of different factors. Number one is all the railroad connections that come in there. Perhaps the most important railroad in this entire group is this one here, East Tennessee Railroad. The East Tennessee Railroad ran from Chattanooga over through the mountain passes to Knoxville. From Knoxville, it connected to different railroads running into the Shenandoah Valley, and from there connecting eventually to Richmond. So this is the lifeline between Chattanooga and Richmond, Virginia. Yankees know this, and they send an army, Union Ninth Corps predominantly in it, under Ambrose Burnside. Remember that name, of course? Burnside. Now, in 1863, he's not at Gettysburg. He and his Ninth Corps are in Tennessee, heading towards Knoxville. There's a lot of other ideas in Chattanooga as well that are important to the Confederate cause, not the least of which is the huge amounts of Confederate ammunition that are stored in Chattanooga. Again, the railroads can bring it in, the railroads can take it out, so it's a very important hub. Wouldn't you think Braxton Bragg would hold this place? Does he? Of course not. Bragg has no interest in holding Chattanooga, despite the fact Jeff Davis has ordered him to hold Chattanooga. And what does he do? Goes right around Chattanooga and heads into North Georgia. Completely abandons Chattanooga. And of course, on the other side, Lincoln is prodding Rosecrans, would go get it, go take Chattanooga, go move south as fast as you can. And the two armies plod towards the south. They finally end up on a pair of diagonal lines parallel to each other, between 20 and 50 miles apart, totally scattered from northeast Alabama through northwest Georgia on up to southern Tennessee. They basically bisect the corner of northwestern Georgia. It is a god-awful mess at that point in time. So let's talk about Texans for a minute. Why is it important? In Bragg's army, you've got two major brigades of Texas troops. The guys on the left, I'm going to introduce, anybody here ever heard of James Deschler? James Deschler is probably the best Confederate general you never heard of. He's good. He's a graduate of West Point. His college best friend is one James Yule Brown Stewart. This guy is Stewart's roommate, folks, and Stewart's best friend at West Point, James Deschler. Oh, by the way, the superintendent when he starts at West Point is one Robert E. Lee. All right, so Deschler. He serves the United States Army. He's out in California. He fights against the Mormons in the Utah thing. And then he is, as a colonel, commands a regiment of troops and then gets a brigade still as a colonel. And he has the unfortunate situation of having being part of the garrison at Fort Heiman when they surrender to William Tecumseh Sherman. Now I'm from Columbus, Ohio area, right? Sherman is too. He's from Lancaster, Ohio. Sherman has Deschler brought forward to him, and he starts talking to him. You know, he related to the Deschlers of Columbus, Ohio. Deschler Ford today is still the largest Ford dealer in Central Ohio. It is the Deschler family. And of course, this Alabama general doesn't want anything to do with the Deschlers north of the Mason-Dixon line or north of the Ohio River. And he vehemently said, and Sherman's like, well, come on, here, calm down, let's talk. He doesn't want any part of William T. Sherman. He stalks off. Deschler and his men are transferred to Camp Douglas in Chicago as prisoners of war. They are going to be exchanged and they're going to be brought back into the Confederate ranks. But now they're dismounted cavalry. They don't have the horses. They're going to get rifles. They're going to be infantry. The other thing is only enough parolees come back to make 2 regiments. So what originally had been a total of 7 different Confederate dismounted cavalry regiments, now you got 2. So to beef this new brigade up and the newly promoted Brigadier General, James Deschler, they throw in a consolidated unit from Arkansas that had surrendered. These guys become known in the Army of Tennessee as the Fort Heiman Cowards, or the Arkansas Post Parolees. They're looked down on by the veterans of the Army who did not surrender at different points. And so these guys have got kind of a burr under their bonnet that they want to at least prove themselves to be good soldiers. Now, Deschler also gets command of the only battery of Texas artillery in the entire Army of Tennessee. It's Captain James Douglas's battery. So Deschler on the left, good soldier, friend of Robert E. Lee, friend of Jeb Stuart. Keep that name in mind, James Deschler. On the right's the exact opposite. Guy on the left, military competence. On the guy on the right, a good ballroom dancer and a good drinker. His name's Matthew Ector. He's the playboy of the Army of Tennessee. He's a widower, recent widower, and apparently must have felt the freedom from his wife or something, because he goes the exact opposite. In mourning, he starts dating every girl he can find. He's out to the wee hours of the morning. Now, this guy's in his mid-40s or so. His staff officers are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, right? He outdances them, outdrinks them, and lasts until the morning when his younger subordinates have to go to bed because they're tired from dancing all night. Ector is still partying on, doing okay. He commands 4 Texas regiments, the 9th Texas Infantry, the 10th Texas Cavalry dismounted, the 14th Texas Cavalry dismounted, and the 32nd Texas Cavalry dismounted. Again, all these guys carrying rifles at this point, even though they're still designated officially as cavalrymen. So really good officer on the left, really bad officer on the right. But we're going to talk a lot about these guys as we move forward. The final group of Texans initially in the Army of Tennessee as they arrive in Georgia is Tom Harrison. You probably have heard of the 8th Texas Cavalry, mounted Terry's Texas Rangers, not the baseball team, not the Cowboys and the lawmen, but they're named for the original Civil War unit, Terry's Texas Rangers. That's their flag on the right. 8th Texas Cavalry is a crack elite unit. They're good. They're really good. Tom Harrison may be the single best Confederate cavalryman you've never heard of. This guy's outstanding. So he's got these 2 Texas regiments, the 8th and 11th. Believe it or not, the state of Texas has a horse shortage. That's why so many of their men are dismounted. And so these are the only 2 cavalry regiments from Texas that actually have horses at this point in time. Now, Bragg has been screaming via telegraph, and anybody that's willing to listen who can get on a train and go back to Richmond, that I'm outnumbered and I need men. And I need lots of men. Richmond is like, oh, yeah, right. Meanwhile, in Washington, they're getting the exact same message from Rosecrans. I need troops. We need more men. Both sides refuse to do anything. So finally, after the Battle of Raymond, Mississippi, the Confederate War Department decides we're going to break apart Joseph Johnston's Army of Mississippi, and we're going to send an entire division from that small army via rail from Enterprise, Mississippi, where they're now camped. We're going to put them on boxcars, and we're going to send them to Atlanta. And from Atlanta, we're going to send these guys up to North Georgia. Among the troops in Johnston's army that are now being transferred to the Army of Tennessee is this guy's troops. He's John Gregg. I call him the John Wayne of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. This is a big, tall, strapping guy. He is charismatic, booming voice, a leader of men, not a follower. You know, this guy is a pretty impressive guy. Huge guy, 6'3", 6'4". So he's Alabamian, but he lives in Fairfield, Texas. But he's not a soldier. He's a college professor. But he is one of the best fighters that the Army of Mississippi had. And he's also a sitting Confederate congressman. So he's your ultimate political general, except he's good. Where you usually think political generals are bad, this guy's good. He knows what he's doing. hence again the John Wayne moniker. And underneath him, maybe the single best colonel in what will now be the Army of Tennessee. Any guys remember the story of the Battle of Franklin, where 6 Confederate generals are killed and they're laid out on a porch side by side? One of those Confederate generals is Hiram Granberry. Granberry, a colonel at the time of Chickamauga, will be promoted to brigadier general and will die with Patrick Cleburne and others at the Battle of Franklin. He is good. Again, very solid Texas troops. Greg commands some other boys that are from Tennessee and from Missouri, but in general, most of these guys are solid troops. The men that have been brought in via rail from Mississippi are added to the Army as a new division to the Army of Tennessee under a commander called Bushrod Johnson. Okay, average, not the greatest, not the worst, but Bushrod Johnson will command what is called the Provisional Division of the Army of Tennessee. So those are the guys that are there. Bragg's not satisfied. I need more men. Lots more men, Richmond. Send me more troops. I can't do anything here in Northwest Georgia without more men. And Richmond's like, what? You already asked for men. Okay, so they start putting troops on trains. More about that in a minute. While all of this is going on, this is Lookout Mountain, not the part of Lookout Mountain you're probably familiar with. This is Lookout Mountain in extreme northwest Georgia, about 25 miles southwest of Chattanooga. This area in here is McLemore's Cove, much like Cades Cove, for example, in the Smokies or whatever. This is a beautiful valley area, really, really nice, very pretty today, extremely pristine. The Yankees are coming through this gap right here, coming down into McLemore's Cove. On the other side of the cove, where I'm standing when I take the picture, behind me is a low range of mountains. On that mountain range is Patrick Cleburne's division of the Confederate Army. Cleburne, with underneath him James Deschler, Stuart's roommate, they are here. So Cleburne, under orders finally from Bragg finally says, we're going to do something, because the Union corps are all spread out. And Bragg finally thinks I got an opportunity to cut the Union Army into pieces. So he orders Cleburne to come down out of the mountain, and you are going to go into that cove that I just showed you, McLemore's Cove, and I want you to attack the Union 14th Corps. This is George Thomas, the Virginian commanding the 14th Corps. Down here at the Alabama border is McCook's 20th Corps. Back up there is Crittenden's Corps as well. And so you've got these Confederates, again, these two lines stretching from Alabama all the way up to Tennessee. And again, 20 to 25, 30, 40 miles apart. Coming down off the mountain, Cleburne decides to attack. A little battle known as Davis's Crossroads. Not a whole lot going on in this battle, but it serves warning to Bragg and to Rosecrans of one very important strategic fact. Your armies are too spread out. Both generals simultaneously and independently decide we're going to pull our armies back together and move towards Chattanooga. So both armies start moving northeast towards Chattanooga. While all this is going on, the War Department is still sending reinforcements to try to calm Bragg down. Specifically, they send this guy. Recognize him? James Longstreet, fresh off the attack of Gettysburg back in July. Longstreet's men have been refitted. They've got new guns, weaponry. They get brand new uniforms, and they are among the troops that are going to be put on trains. Pickett's division is still too shot up from Gettysburg, so Pickett's men will stay in Richmond. But the other two divisions that fought at Gettysburg under Longstreet, Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood, those two divisions are going to be put on trains in Richmond. Now, here's the problem. Remember I said the railroad from Richmond earlier went through Knoxville, and now that railroad's out of commission because by now It's been severed by the Yankees. Ambrose Burnside has severed the East Tennessee Railroad. The only way the Confederacy can send troops via rail from Virginia is to send them down to South Carolina. And then across from South Carolina into eastern Georgia, Augusta area, from Augusta to Atlanta, and Atlanta on up to northwest Georgia. It's a long, circuitous route that Burnside, amazing stroke of luck, has just severed the rebel plans to send troops to reinforce. So Longstreet's men are going to be sent. He has his entire artillery, every single gun of the Confederate First Corps are staged and going to be sent south. But the Confederacy decides to send the infantry first, starting with John Bell Hood's division. Do you realize not a single gun in Longstreet's entire First Corps will make it to Chickamauga in time for the battle? Not one. And a third of Longstreet's infantrymen will not make it to Chickamauga either. The reason being is that railroad. In green is 1 gauge. That's the southern gauge, 5 feet wide. In red, of course, is the standard gauge. Notice all the railroads in Georgia. Southern gauge. All the railroads in Virginia. Different gauge, folks. So you can't run a train from Virginia to Atlanta. Won't work. You're going to have to take the trains, what few you can muster up, and you're going to send those trains one by one down to where the connections are with the green railroad lines, where everybody's got to get off the trains. All the boxcars have to be unloaded. Every single gun, every single piece of ammunition, every single ambulance, every single wagon, everything has got to be unloaded and then reloaded onto another railroad. You think that causes time delays, folks? Big time delays. The other problem that the Confederacy faces is in some of these towns where they're changing trains, a lot of these soldiers decide, you know, there's pretty girls in these towns. There's good food. And approximately 5% of Longstreet's First Corps never arrives. Interestingly, there's a whole bunch of well, they're not technically called deserters. They're men on furlough who are just conveniently forget to come back. And so you've got a manpower reduction happening on Longstreet's men as all this is going forward. Fast forward all the way now to September 16th. John Bell Hood, back in Richmond, has watched his men leave. You may know that John Bell Hood had been severely wounded at Gettysburg, has an arm that's pretty much useless, at least at that point in time. He's been ordered not to go to Georgia. So he goes on his charger, his horse, and he watches ruefully as trainload after trainload after trainload of Texans depart. He can't go. And then it's time for Henry Benning's Georgia Brigade and John Bell Hood, ever the calm, patient man. John Bell Hood says, I'm going to get on this train full of Georgians. He puts his horse on the train, doesn't have any baggage, and jumps on board himself with a bunch of Georgians who are looking at him like, that's our division commander. What are you doing on here? Aren't you supposed to be back in Richmond? But John Bell Hood decides, I'm going where the action is. This man leads from the front, and he's going to continue to do that. So among his troops, of course, we're all familiar with Hood's Texas Brigade, right? Perhaps the most famous Texas troops of the Civil War, maybe the Texas Rangers notwithstanding. 1st Texas, 4th Texas, 5th Texas, 3rd Arkansas, you know the names. These are the guys that assaulted Little Round Top, assaulted Hawks Ridge at Gettysburg, and were shot to pieces at Gettysburg. They pretty much have recovered as much of their guys as they can. But the other issue is these guys have been issued brand new uniforms before they got on the train. And the uniforms are of blue denim. Anybody know what fresh blue jeans look like, right? They're nice and dark blue, right? These are Confederate troops, folks. As you can see in this great and very accurate drawing of these reenactors wearing the correct Confederate uniforms of who they're actually in Macklemore's Cove, by the way, which they never got to, but they're there. There they are, these Confederate soldiers wearing blue. They will roll in to Catoosa Station, north of Ringgold, Georgia. They will jump off the trains, they'll line up, and all these veterans of the Army of Tennessee take one look at them, and they're like, my God, that's Hood's Texas Brigade? Those are the guys with the reputation? They look like bandbox soldiers. One guy will write in his diary, we cannot believe that these were the same troops we heard about fighting so valiantly at Gettysburg. They're a bunch of crackers, fresh out of military school or something, with these brand new blue jean uniforms. And so they get off the train and everybody's kind of mocking them, like, okay, you Easterners, I don't think Easterners can actually fight. They are being held in reserve because they're tired from the long train ride. It takes 2 whole days for the entire brigade to arrive because those trains have gotten split up and spread out, but finally Hood's Texans are on the site. All right, so let's talk about the battle itself. These two sides are almost identical, both in manpower and in organization. At Gettysburg, of course, Robert E. Lee has 3 corps. The Yankees have 7 corps at Gettysburg. Here at Chickamauga, it's almost identical. Hap Thomas, you got McCook, you got Crittenden, you got a reserve corps under Gordon Granger, later of Juneteenth fame, and you got the cavalry. On the Army of Tennessee, you got Leonidas Polk, D.H. Hill, Simon Bolivar Buckner, and you got D.H. Walker. And then you got 2 cavalry corps. Why? Because Fighting Joe Wheeler likes to fight with Nathan Bedford Forrest. They won't work under each other. And so Bragg has this extra problem that his cavalry commanders can't stand each other. And so he always keeps Fighting Joe Wheeler on his left and Nathan Bedford Forrest on his right, and keeps the army between them. So you got all these troops. And then, of course, you got all Longstreet's boys on their way. So that's what we got. Now, I look at Chickamauga very simple, as if you picture a zipper, kind of cockeyed, heading to 45-degree angle, being zipped from the top and being closed as you get closer to the bottom. That's Chickamauga in a nutshell. The fighting's going to start at the extreme point of the zipper, where the 2 armies, remember, they're both moving towards Chattanooga, and they're actually moving closer and closer with every hour. And so Bragg's plan is pretty simple. This is West Chickamauga Creek right here. There are only a few ways to cross that creek. The first way is right here, the dam at Lee and Gordon's Mill. Now, Chickamauga Creek, for those who may not be aware of it, originates in that mountain peak I showed you earlier, Lookout Mountain. Now, September 1863 has been ice cold. In fact, the United States, including New Jersey, has been having record cold in September of 1863. Look at your local weather reports here. Your temperature here is in the 40s. Well, down south, it's colder, believe it or not. It's below freezing in September. This creek is running really, really ice cold, and it comes up to about your armpits. So you're going to cross that creek here, holding your gun over your head, freezing to death. But that's there. Dalton's Ford, right down here, where Preston's Floridians are, same thing. So really, the best way to get across the creek are here, Alexander's Bridge and Reed's Bridge. Those will become the focal points of the first attacks at Chickamauga. This is Reed's Bridge, Chickamauga Creek, Reed's Bridge here. Now, what's fascinating about this is, any guys military veterans? Raise your hands. All right, thank you for your service, and I mean that. If you're in the military, you've got a wooden bridge between you and the enemy, and you're ordered to dismantle the bridge. It's a wooden bridge. Where do you put the planks? Which side of the creek? Your side or the enemy side? Wrong. They put them on the Yankee side, Confederate side. So these Union cavalrymen stack up these planks very neatly, on the Confederate side of the river. It's not a big deal at all for the Confederates, Bushrod Johnson's Provisional Brigade, and our friend John Gregg, the John Wayne of the Confederacy. Gregg's men simply rebuild the bridge, and they cross over it under Union cavalry carbine fire, and they easily start driving off the Yankees. Well, that bridge is real easy to take. Just downstream, it's a little trickier at Alexander's Bridge because it's defended by John T. Wilder's Lightning Brigade. If you remember with these guys who'd fought at Hoover's Gap back in the Tullahoma campaign, they are equipped with 20-shot repeaters. These are the guns the Confederates kid about, or maybe ruefully kid, that the Yankees load them on Sunday and fire them all week long. These 20-shot guns. Wilder's Lightning Brigade holds that bridge for hours and hours and hours. Finally, the overwhelming number of Confederates will force them back, and now everything is pushed back. All night long on September 18th, Bragg starts pouring the Army of Tennessee across West Chickamauga Creek. He gets a third of his army across during that night. At the same time they're going on, he's recalled Claiborne on Pigeon Mountain and said, get your troops down here double quick as fast as you can. Everything devolves into a night fight. Remember, these zippers are still touching each other, and after dark, there's a very rare for that point in the Civil War night fight in the woods of Chickamauga between Hiram Granberry's 7th Texas. They're going to fight against Wilder in the middle of the dark. It's single-shot Confederate infields against the 20-shot Yankee guns. And so Granberry wisely decides, I'm just going to stay put, and we're going to shoot some Yankees in the dark. We're not going to do anything really aggressive. But both armies that night received messages from the front. Armies have connected. We need to send more troops. Bragg and Rosecrans issue orders during the night, hustling more troops to the northeast to the scene of the burgeoning battle along West Chickamauga Creek. September 19th, the fighting's going to begin with our party animal, Matthew Ector. He's fronted by Nathan Bedford Forrest mounted infantry. They go off into the woods. Now, anybody ever been, for those who've never been to Chickamauga, this is the wilderness on steroids. This is a god-awful place with, second growth timber and vines and ravines and creeks. I mean, it's an awful place. It's like the wilderness, only a Western version, perhaps far worse. While all this is going on, Ector gets orders to attack with his men, dismounted Texas cavalry. Matthew Ector is a very good dancer. He's not a very good general. He pulls his men into the woods without flankers on either side, without skirmishers in front. Folks, that's a recipe for disaster. And exactly what you figure is going to happen does happen. He's hit in the flank by Union veterans. They're going to rip through the Texas and Arkansans and Missourians, and Ector's men are going to be chewed to pieces. That in turn will cause Nathan Bedford Forrest to withdraw. And so the first Confederate attack at Chickamauga is a dismal failure. Thank you, Matthew Ector. So Ector and Forrest withdraw. Fighting continues with other troops, and they decide, let's try it again. And so we're going to send Matthew Ector in with a second time. How many think Matthew Ector's learned his lesson? Of course not. He's a good dancer. He should have understood. He's going back into the same moves he made before that didn't work. And this time he's almost surrounded. Because again, no flankers, no skirmishers, no hope. It's so bad that the Union counterattack by King's United States regulars almost cuts off an entire Confederate brigade. And Ector's kind of paralyzed. His adjutant takes control of the brigade on the battlefield, basically says, Brigadier General, move over. They're my troops. And his adjutant managed to get most of Ector's men off the board. They're not going to fight again for today. They're done. Nathan Bedford Forrest is done as well, but Ector has almost single-handedly ruined the early Confederate attacks. But that zipper continues to zip throughout the last morning. Troops from the Army of Tennessee, veterans under names like Frank Cheatham and Alexander Stewart, people like that are now connecting with the Union forces and shooting them down. We go down the zipper by mid-afternoon, and you've got John Bell Hood on the field. His men are shocked to see Hood there. You're not supposed to be with us. They're wildly cheering the arrival of their beloved commander, and Hood takes personal charge of the center of the Confederate battlefield. None of these people around him have any clue who John Bell Hood is. They've never met the guy before, most of them. He's got one arm in a sling. He's got a horse, no provisions. His men are, kind of inspired. And about that time, John Gregg goes down. The John Wayne of the Army has been shot. He's laying in the woods. He rolls over when a bunch of Yankees are coming at him, rolls underneath a bunch of bushes, figures he's going to be captured, and all of a sudden he hears the Texas drawl as the first Texas of John Bell Hood's men arrive on the field. They'll pick up John Gregg. John Gregg will become their almost personal mission. Get General Gregg to the rear. Let's help this man from Fairfield, Texas survive. Hood's men are on the prowl. With him is Henry Benning's Georgians, and they are going to launch a fierce attack on the Vineyard Farm. Now, Hood's men were last in combat on Little Round Top. Here they are back. Well, technically, some of them fought on July 3rd against Farnsworth's brigade at Gettysburg. But for most of these guys, they haven't fought since July 2nd. They're going to come charging across through here. They're going to rout an entire Union brigade, and then they're going to get shot to pieces with double canister at 50 yards. A commander of the Union artillery that's blasting huge holes into Hood's blue jean decked out men is a captain from Indiana. He looks across the field and sees all these men injured, badly injured, needing medical attention, and realizes we don't have anything to help these guys. The Union commander, after the Civil War, is so haunted by what he saw his guns did to Hood's Texans that he decides to dedicate his life to medicine. Captain Eli Lilly, the founder of Eli Lilly Corporation, which is still, of course, one of America's largest drug houses. It starts at Chickamauga. So Lilly's men are shooting the bejeebers out of the Texans, and again, the attack fails. And for the second straight time, we failed at Little Round Top, and now the Texans have failed at Vineyard Field. They're wearing blue jeans, but they can't clear the enemy, at least at this point. While this is going on, Patrick Cleburne finally shows up. These guys have been hot rushing the 35 or so miles for 2 days from Pigeon Mountain, and here they come with James Deschler. They're going to launch a spirited night attack, the largest night attack of the Civil War up to this point. They're ripping through Union defenses. They will push the Yankees back for a full mile in the woods. And then the soldiers really can't see each other than the flashes of the guns. And then the treetops catch on fire because there's been a drought in northwestern Georgia for almost a year. And the timber is really dry. And what do you think a burning tree does eventually? Sets the ground on fire underneath it. An entire Union aid station in a barn burns. Every single United States soldier dies that's in that aid station. They all die. Burning, middle of the night, gruesome way to go. Battlefield only lit by the burning trees and the burning brush of this horrific battlefield, which most soldiers there say was the worst night of the Civil War that any of them ever experienced on the Confederate side or the Union side. All right, so Deschler's men are finally stopped. Cleburne's attack stops. On the morning of the 20th, they decide we're going to attack again. Now, James Deschler's a guy who leads from the front. They're going to have a vicious attack that, again, Union artillery breaks up. they are going to go to ground along a low ridge. They're laying there, they're half out of ammunition. James Deschler starts crawling among his men to get ammunition, to calm his men down. It's all okay, no problem. And either an Ohio or an Illinois artilleryman spots a crawling Confederate about 400 yards off on that ridge and puts a cannonball right through Jim Deschler's heart. Dies instantly, of course. James Deschler. Here's the backstory 2 weeks later. When Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee hear about Deschler's death, Stuart openly cries like a baby. Robert E. Lee withdraws to his tent and sobbing is heard. It's the only time I can find in the entire Civil War that Robert E. Lee has that kind of emotion. James Deschler, a guy you never heard of, caused Robert E. Lee to tears when news of his death. It's also the only time I can find that Robert E. Lee reacts to any death of a Confederate officer not under his command. He's not the Army commander at this point of all the Confederate armies. He's just Northern Virginia. And Deschler, that's his mortuary marker, of course. He's dead. Cleburne's men are stalemated. Not much is happening here on the third day of the fighting. But remember I said the orders have been to keep moving to the northeast? One Union division commander apparently doesn't realize the battle's here, folks. And he continues to pull his men to the northeast. He pulls them out of line, and that creates what? A massive gap at the Brotherton Farm. And by now, Jim Longstreet has arrived via train. Oh, he is hot to trot. He is ticked. He's come in late the previous evening. Now he's James Longstreet, he's Lieutenant General, right? Wouldn't you think, as a Lieutenant General, that the commander of this army that I'm going to rescue would leave somebody at the train station to greet me? Of course not. He's got no clue where Braxton Bragg is. I don't know where the armies can. Keep in mind, even though Longstreet's from Georgia, he doesn't have a clue who these commanders are. He doesn't know where the headquarters is. He finally has to have some of his scouts go out and figure out where the Confederate headquarters is. He knocks on the door and learns that Bragg's asleep for the night and cannot be disturbed. Longstreet takes that real gently, of course. Open the door. They do. I mean, I can argue with the Lieutenant General. They wake Braxton Bragg up. And to Longstreet's horror, Bragg says, "Oh, this is kind of what I want to do. By the way, you're in charge of the entire center." Okay, say what? What's the tactical situation? Who are the men? Who am I commanding? What's there? Longstreet shows up on the third day of the battle, and he's got this problem. I got to figure out what in the world's going on. Oh, but there's a hole in the Yankee line. I don't care who you are. Move your brigade there. You take your division that way. He will start commanding troops of the Army of Tennessee. Give them orders. Longstreet, the guy everybody thinks is passive at Gettysburg, is a rock at Chickamauga. He is attacking. He's fierce. He's moving. He's decisive. He's not lollygagging. He's putting every troop he can into that hole at Brotherton Field. And among them are all these veterans you probably know. Here's Robertson's Texans, Benning's Georgians. Look down here. Here's Joseph Kershaw's South Carolinians. And behind them down here is Humphreys Mississippians, commanded at Gettysburg by William S. Barksdale. So this is the second day at Gettysburg, guys. You know, the whole Confederate international on attack. There they are. And right behind them comes the beginning of Lafayette McLaws' men. The rest of them are never going to get there. I took this picture right here. I'm standing on this road right by this farmhouse, the Dyer Farm, looking up towards Dyer Field. Hood's Texas Brigade will charge almost 1.5 miles across that open field. And for the third straight charge, Little Round Top, Vineyard Field, North Dyer Field, Hood's Texans failed. They're not going to drive the Yankees off that hill. Why? Because look at all those counterattacks coming in on them. Lots of Buckeyes, lots of Ohio troops, some Illinois boys in there as well. They come into this woodlot right here. and they will start shooting Texas to pieces. Remember, the Texans were in blue jeans, right? Finally, Jerome Robertson and John Bell Hood order retreats, and Hood's Texas Brigade skedaddles all the way back across this field into these woods right here on Dyer's farm, here and here. Somebody starts shooting into the woods. We don't know to this day if it's Yankees from Indiana or it's Confederates in the Army of Tennessee. To see all these blue guys coming at them in the woods, and they assume the Yankees are counterattacking, and they start shooting friendly fire at the oncoming Hood's Texas Brigade. Whoever shoots them, John Bell Hood goes down. Hit in the thigh. John Bell Hood is initially thought that he's going to die. They managed to stabilize the guy. They're going to put him in a carriage. Enslaved individuals would carry him for more than 26 miles back to a farmhouse where John Bell Hood is nursed back to health. He's going to lose a leg, gets amputated. His men, again, shot to pieces in this woods. So while this is going on, Charles L. Dana, the Assistant Secretary of War, has left. Rosecrans has left. Crittenden, the Corps commander, has left the field. The Chief of Staff of the Army of the Cumberland has left. Oh, he's a name you probably have heard. Like me, he's from Ohio. Chief of Staff is Colonel James Abram Garfield, future President of the United States. Garfield leaves the field as well. And that leaves one Virginia-born Corps commander that most of the people don't really trust, and they think he's so slow they call him Old Pap. And yet George Thomas, a Virginian, pulls together every single troop he can find on Snodgrass Hill and around, and they form this wonderful Union defensive line. Some of you might remember this from the American Heritage Civil War series in 1964. Yeah. Remember that when you were kids?
Yeah.
Yeah, they had all these. I used to play Army men under my dad's orchard, setting up Chickamauga. Little did I ever know I'd be writing a book on the battle. But this is the final thing. Here's Matthew Ector, who actually does well, finally. Why? Because his adjutant's still in command. But Ector's men do well. Here is Deschler's men now under Roger Mills. Here's Robertson's brigade. Sheffield's Alabamans, you may remember them. They're commanded at Gettysburg by William Oates. That's the guys that hit Little Round Top, Oates Alabamians, etc., Vander Law's troops. And so this is the situation as the Union line holds out and then finally collapses. Everybody's heading back to Chattanooga, where General Rosecrans is already there with his force, with the Assistant Secretary of War telling Washington, we've won a great victory. We have Chattanooga. You just lost a whole bunch of guys. Okay, but you got Chattanooga. Sounds good. And of course, Pap Thomas goes down into history with his new nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga. I had 4 ancestors fight under Pap Thomas. The guy's a legend in our family because our Civil War ancestors just adored this guy, adored him. In fact, I've had my own ancestors will tell you that Pap Thomas was better than Grant or Sherman. That's a little bit of a stretch, but hey, you know. Chickamauga goes down in history as the second bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. There are more than 1,000 books on the Gettysburg Campaign, 22 of which I've written. There are 86 or 87 books on Chickamauga, 1 of which I've written. This is the most underreported battle of the Civil War. There are far more books on Shiloh, Spotsylvania, Wilderness, etc. They're on Chickamauga. Of course, it's a major Confederate victory. And so a lot of Yankees don't want to talk about this battle. But you lose 34,500 men. I mean, this is just god-awful killing over the 3 days. Now, here's the aftermath. Of course, Braxton Bragg will put Chattanooga under siege. Rosecrans, continuing to beg for more troops, gets fired. And for his efforts, they send U.S. Grant into Chattanooga. Grant eventually will relieve the siege. He will bring in his own troops from the Army of the Potomac. Did you know the 11th and 12th Corps that fought at Gettysburg, Howard's men and Slocum's men, are sent by train on gauges that match through East Tennessee, and they arrive at Chattanooga on Confederate railroads. They arrive safe and sound, and the 11th and 12th Corps will never rejoin the Army of the Potomac. They're now permanently out west. Grant, of course, will relieve this. His Sherman and Hooker will lead attacks. They will drive the Confederates back. Braxton Bragg, by now, every single major subordinate hates this guy's guts. And Jeff Davis has to come do political triage and try to figure out what's going on. He's so frustrated by the situation, he will fire Braxton Bragg. So both Rosecrans and Bragg do not survive the year that started with the stalemate at Stones River. By the time the year is over, Middle Tennessee has been lost forever to the Confederate cause. At a point in time, it's done. Joseph Johnston, sent from the Army in Mississippi to command, and brings his men with him. They combine them into the Army of Tennessee. In 1893, the state of Texas sends Colonel Mills, that's Deschler's replacement, Captain Douglas of the artillery, and a Texas United States senator to locate the positions. They can find everybody's positions but Ector's, because nobody in Ector's brigade wants to fess up to where they were on the first day and with the disaster that happened. But they know every other position. They actually put markers on the ground, and they're going to put a Texas marker up in 1895. It takes till 1964 before Texas finally comes up and actually puts in the Texas Monument. In October 1946, a year after the atomic bombs are dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Wiley Wood Foster dies at the age of 101. 18th Texas Cavalry, the last known survivor of Chickamauga, is a Texan who lives until 1946. So with that, you've now heard the story of Chickamauga through the eyes of the Texas troops who were there. May the Yellow Rose of Texas forever be friendly. Have a great night.